Welcome everyone to week 8 of winter quarter at UCLA and the Sports Business Association here. I'm super excited to announce another guest speaker, an amazing alumni as well herself, and that will be Dr. Karen Cogan. And I'm super excited to bring back another guest speaker this quarter, and also just for all of us to learn as well from her experience, from her journey as well, from UCLA to becoming a senior sports psychologist for the Olympic Committee. So we'll kind of go through a little bit of her story. We'll have time once again where I will kind of lead a question and answer with her as well from the pre-planned questions from the executive board. And then we'll open up questions for the rest of the chat as well. So you guys, if you guys have questions while she's speaking, feel free to throw them in the chat. Also feel free to use the raise hand feature and I can call on you guys at the end and we can answer all you guys' questions. So super excited. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Karen. We're so excited to have you here. And just to give everyone a recap, Dr. Karen Cogan is a senior sports psychologist for the United States Olympic Committee for almost 11 years now. Like I said, she is a UCLA alumnus. She had her BA in psychology, like myself, and she also got a master's in kinesiology from UCLA. Important also to note, she was a gymnast here, also a student athlete, which Karen makes up a decent amount of the members here at BISBA as well. It's a mix between student athletes and students here, just to have that passion and drive of working in the sports industry post-grad. And so super excited for that. Not only shortly after she got her master's in kinesiology, she got a PhD from The Ohio State University in psychology as well. And then in 2000, she published her first book, Sports Psychology Library, Gymnastics, and her work has appeared in sports-related journals all over. As you can kind of see the book right there on the right-hand side. She's also a member of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. She served as the secretary, treasurer, and council representative for the Exercise Sports Psychology Division 47 of the APA as well. So at this moment, I will stop sharing and we'll also give Karen warm, once again, welcome. Happy to have you here. And we'd love just to have you kind of walk us through your story, tell us more about yourself, and then I'll start to pick up some of the questions from there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Christina. Thanks for that introduction. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I got where I'm at. And I was a gymnast as my sport, as Christina said, and I competed in gymnastics for 10 years. And during that time, I really got to see the mental side for myself. So I did a lot of experiments on myself, and I was doing this a long time ago. So back then, sports psychology wasn't even really a field. It certainly wasn't well known. I think there might have been 5 books on it in the whole library or something. But anyhow, I learned from myself because I realized that there were some days that I performed well and my mind was in the right place, and there were other days I just couldn't get it together and things were terrible. And I wondered why, like, why is that, and how do you have more control over your mental processes and how does that impact performance? So, I started early on wondering about those things. And by the time I got to UCLA, sports psychology was a little bit more well known, but it certainly wasn't a big field. And so I would tell people that's what I wanted to do. And they asked me what that was. Nobody knew what it was. Then when I was at UCLA, I had 2 pretty serious knee injuries, which eventually ended in my early retirement from my sport. Was not on my terms, unfortunately. And that also gave me some insights into the mental aspects and the mental health aspects related to sport and having to end before I was ready. So I think all of that together really allowed me to go forward in this field of sports psychology. And at the time, in the kinesiology department, there was a sports psychology emphasis. So I thought, well, okay, that's where I'm going to start then. I'll get a master's degree there. And I worked with Tara Scanlon, who recently is retired from UCLA, but she goes way back, and learned so much from her, and she mentored me into the field. what I realized was that you really needed to have a background in psychology. I needed to be a licensed psychologist to help athletes in every aspect of their mental health. So not just the performance side of things, but also the mental health side of things. So that's where I ended up at Ohio State and got a doctoral degree there in psychology. And while there wasn't necessarily a sports psychology program there, there were a couple of faculty members who were working with sport teams there. And I was able to get on with them and work with teams. And at one point, my advisor said, well, I think you need your own team now. She said, there is a gymnastics team here, so maybe start with them. So I worked with them through the rest of my graduate school years, and I think put together a pretty good program so that when I left, they were asking who else can we work with? I was leaving to go on my internship. And so I connected them up with one of the other graduate students there. But so that's kind of how I got my start. And then, I think something important to know is that I didn't right away jump into my work with the Olympic Committee. That took some time to develop my career, to get experience working with Olympic sports. I worked as a contractor for several years with winter sports. I worked with the US ski team. That's how I got my start with Olympic sports. And that then allowed me to work into this full-time position that I have now, where now I'm working with summer sports. And I have all the acrobat and combat sports. So I have 11 sports that I'm responsible for at this point. I've been to 6 Olympic Games in various capacities as a sports psychologist. And then Tokyo this past year was to be my 7th Olympic Games. We are still very certain that that's going to take place. It's just going to be a year later. So I am looking forward to that. I know it will not be the same as any other Olympics I've been to. It's going to be very different. We're just going to be so pleased if we can pull that off and get our athletes to an Olympic Games. So that's where I am now. This year has been very different than ever before in my world. I'm doing everything remotely, and that is not usually how I do my work, but we've all had to adapt. So I'm just looking forward to getting to Tokyo and working with these athletes and finding some success there.
Yeah, no, that's so awesome. And it's so cool to kind of hear about your journey and also talk about how it wasn't just a linear route. I think that's something a lot of upcoming seniors and graduates are starting to realize is that stress of like the career pressure and what's the next step and feeling like things have to be linear when it's not necessarily like it works like that. My first question that I have for you, because of that background in kinesiology and then kind of pivoting also into the PhD in psychology, I think it's so important to like recognize that importance of mental health within the athletic community. I know for myself as a student athlete, it's something that's pretty stigmatized as well. And I think so a lot of maybe other athletes on the call can relate to that. But as everyone who kind of wants to work in sports or work around the game, work around athletes, I think it's important to note that as well. So for you, the first question is, when did you kind of realize that significance for the mental health aspect, almost as like equally as important as the physical aspect? And I know you kind of spoke about having some injuries as well, but when for you did you kind of realize, oh, they are, not, if not more, like equally important for an athlete's performance?
I think I always had a sense that that was an important piece of it. And um, I can't remember ever thinking that, oh, it's just all about the performance and it's not about the person. So my philosophy has always been about this athlete as a, not just a body doing sports, but as a person and an athlete who has a life history and things that happen in your life impact you, not just as an athlete, but as a person, So I think I've always seen it as kind of that mind body connection and the whole person. And I think it really was, it was brought home for me with my own injury. And so 2 in a row, basically 2 knee injuries in a row, which then made it very difficult to keep going. And I wasn't ready to stop. I felt like I hadn't reached my potential. I was just on the edge of reaching my potential and never really got to see that happen. So it was a very difficult time. And coping with having to retire from my sport and have that conversation with the coach, even though he knew, like he knew for a while that it was probably that was the end for me. And he was very patient, he just kind of waited for me to come to him and have that conversation. But it was very, very difficult. And then to try to go on and decide, okay, well, what do I do from here? Because as those of you who are athletes probably know, so much of your identity is tied up as an athlete. And then all of a sudden out of your control, that's not a part of what you're doing. So now what? But I think for me, I was fortunate that my academics had always been important, and I did have that going for me already. And so then I really poured all of my emphasis into that. And yeah, again, to answer your question, I think to me, it's always been an important part. And I think that's why my doctoral degree is in psychology as opposed to sports science. It's in psychology because it's the person that I'm concerned about.
Right. No, and that makes sense. And one of my roommates, actually, our former roommates from UCLA, she had dealt with 2 knee injuries as well and made her medically retire. And so as you were speaking about that process, like I definitely thought of her and how it was equally as, I think, very difficult, as it's like a moment of like where you're really distraught. You don't know what to do. It's kind of out of the surprise. And so that's something that's not really often talked about as well. And I'm also curious too, for athletes, since it is so stigmatized, and I think it just kind of depends on the culture of the team, whether it's accepted. I know some sports teams at UCLA have psychologists and some don't. So what would you say to athletes, or in general for students that are apprehensive about seeing a sports psychologist or unsure if they should see one, depending on the stressors they're going through?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and I guess I should first distinguish. There's a couple of different ways to get into the field of sports psychology. One is through the sports sciences, so the kinesiology route that I started off in, and that's really training practitioners to be educators and to teach mental skills, and it's really very focused on performance. Whereas the psychology route, that I'm a licensed psychologist, and so that allows me to treat mental illness and mental health. And so I have training in both areas. Not everybody has that training, but I think it's really that has allowed me to kind of move between both of those worlds, and not just it's not just about performance, but it's also about the person. And so, and I now I lost track of what was the question.
Oh, it was no, that was a good context and background to it. It was just like, what advice would you give to students or athletes who are kind of apprehensive about seeing a sports psychologist or a
Right.
psychologist for the first time?
Right. Yes. Okay. So what I tell athletes is, you don't have to have a problem to come in and see me. What we're looking at from the performance end of things, we're looking at how do you get that extra edge? So things could be going fine, but do you have a good pre-performance plan? Do you have a way of managing unexpected things, or maybe a mistake and recovering from that? Do you have strategies for that? If not, let's talk about them. And that's going to give you that extra edge. So maybe when those things happen, you go, oh, yes, right, I have a plan for that. And it's not cause for panic. So we talk a lot about, you can come see me because you just want to get better. You want that edge, but you can also come talk to me because life is not going the way you want it to. You're having trouble with a relationship, or maybe there's a communication problem with the coach, or could be depression and eating disorder. It could be something more serious. And so we can talk about that too. Anything is fair game in my world, whatever you feel comfortable talking about. And I think what we found with our athletes at the Olympic level is several high profile athletes have come forward talking about their mental health concerns, and it helps other athletes realize, okay, I'm not alone. And if this is something I'm struggling with, Michael Phelps has been very public about it. Michael Phelps, with all these gold medals and Olympic medals and well-known, he's struggled with mental health. So maybe I can talk about it too. So I think, we're really trying to break down that stigma and provide a lot of resources to the athletes so that they can ask for that help when they need it.
Yeah, I think also going off of that point of how it is so stigmatized, but some athletes are coming out, like you said, Michael Phelps, and even like having him work with like the Calm app, and then even UCLA alum Kevin Love too, supporting current athletes by providing like Headspace subscriptions. What else do you think it takes to kind of destigmatize this narrative around sports psychology in the athletic community?
Well, what we're doing right now, anyhow, with the Olympic Committee is that we have just hired a mental health director, and her name is Jess Bartley. She is responsible for providing mental health services and programs to all of our athletes, providing referral networks. We just instituted a crisis hotline for people who are struggling and need to call somebody. There are a lot of resources we've been putting together, and we have been publicizing this big time to all of our sports. We've also had so many asking for help in these areas. And so I think the timing is really good to put all that out there. And so now what we've done is, instead of saying, no, we don't have these resources, now we can say, yes, we have these resources. We can get people connected immediately. And it's such a better process than it used to be, when we just didn't have these things in place. So I think we're talking a lot about it. We're offering it to athletes. Athletes are coming forward and telling their stories. That's been really powerful.
Hmm. Definitely. And also kind of going off of that as well, knowing that you work with so many different types of athletes from different sports, especially at such an elite level, do you approach athletes from different sports differently? Are the dynamics different for that? Or how do you go about working with different athletes from totally different backgrounds?
I would say that there are probably more similarities than differences in terms of the mental strategies athletes use. But at the same time, I have, as I said, the acrobat and combat sports. So the acrobat sports are things like gymnastics, diving, artistic swimming. Used to be called synchronized swimming. It's now called artistic swimming. We just had skateboarding and surfing added for 2020 or now 2021 for the first time. So I have that group. And then I have combat sports, which is things like fencing, wrestling, judo, taekwondo, and boxing. And, those are pretty different groups, I would say. People wonder, how did those get put together? How can you work with both of those groups? But I think the reason they're together is because they're all fast acting, sort of quick action sports as opposed to endurance sports. So I think that's why they were together. But they are different. And so, with the acrobat sports, we're dealing with athletes who typically compete individually. There are some team or synchronized events, but typically compete individually, and they're dealing with equipment that is stable and steady, so they're not dealing with something coming at them or moving. And they're dealing with potentially very frightening types of moves. And so there's some fear that they experience and some mental blocks they experience sometimes. So in that way, we use a lot of imagery related to their acrobatic skills. We talk a lot about mindfulness and staying present, staying in the moment, taking it one thing at a time. And we deal with those fears. With the combat sports, you're dealing with another person, an opponent, and so you can have a great plan, but there's never a routine like there is in some of the acrobat sports. You kind of know what to expect. With the combat sports, you don't know what to expect, and you have to be able to think quickly on your feet and then read the opponent and decide how to respond. So not only is it your plan, but you're dealing with somebody else's plan too, and sometimes you have to change things midway through. So in that way, we're talking a lot about handling that sort of pressure, reading the opponent, knowing how to respond to that. So in that way, those things are different. And primarily, most of my sports are individual sports, but some of them have a team component. So then you're switching gears, because the one day you're competing against your teammate, the next day you're on the same team with them, and you have to come together, and so that can be kind of difficult sometimes. But yeah, and every athlete, I think, is an individual too, based on their culture, their life history, things that have happened to them, successes, failures. And so really I have to treat each individual athlete very individually outside of their sport. So there's just a lot of factors that I'm looking at anytime I meet with somebody.
Right. That seems like more than just like a lot or even just like a few, I think it's so interesting. I mean, even hearing the difference between like the combat versus like acrobatic sports, and the different styles of like mental training that goes into each one, also factoring what works for one individual, what one person might be going through on top of that too. And like having all of that come into your practice is is definitely very seemingly complex too, and being able to adapt different styles. So, are there main or prominent techniques that some of the top athletes use? I know you kind of mentioned like visualization. I know in my sport of track and field, that's a huge one that we work on as well. Are there any other main techniques that people tend to gravitate towards in their mental training and meetings with you?
Yeah, imagery is a big one. I've used that for many, many years with athletes, and I've started to use more in the past, maybe 2, 3, 4 years, some mindfulness training and meditation. And I think that's become really popular in all areas for all people, but it's really relevant to our sports, because in sports, it's very important to be present and to be mindful and to know what your experience is. And if you're reacting to something, or if you want to adjust your focus and react differently. It's really important to know those things. So we do a lot of training along those lines. What I've been doing also recently more now is, how do you deal with unexpected events, and how do you deal with, things like a pandemic, and all of a sudden it's not the way you thought it was going to be, and how can you quickly adjust to that? One of the things we talk about is, right now the whole world is dealing with this pandemic, and our job is to do it better than anybody else, and to take that edge with us into competition. So we're looking at what if scenarios. What if this happens? What do we do? And those sorts of things, planning ahead. And overall, with athletes, typically I'm looking at, okay, you can learn breathing techniques, you can learn mindfulness, you can learn imagery, and then what's going to be your pre-performance plan? So what kinds of things are you going to use going into competition to help perform your best? And that's going to be very individualized, but they can pick and choose from these different techniques that we learn, and come up with their own individualized plan. It could be very complex, like they start the night before taking a focus, using breathing techniques, using imagery, and then narrow it down as they get closer to competition. Or some like it very simple, just a few keywords that they use to get themselves in the right state of mind. So again, another very individualized process.
Yeah, and even I guess going off that, I'll ask just a few more, and I see some questions also in the chat. So feel free if you guys have questions to put them in the chat, and I'll be able to integrate all of those in as well. One question I wanted to ask is, we kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier about how COVID has totally changed things. I mean, even the Olympics being postponed a year, and even just the year we had in 2020, and all of these events occurring. I'm curious how your work has changed. What has been made more difficult maybe on your end, or maybe on the athlete's end as well? Yeah, what has been like your main challenge and your main adaptation throughout this COVID year?
We kind of saw it coming. I had been in Europe actually, and had just gotten back, and we were starting to hear that there was this new virus, and watch out, and within a couple of weeks, everything shut down. And I have a team that I work with, other sports psychologists. There are 7 of us full time, and we said, this is not going to be good. We need to be prepared. So we pretty quickly threw together some resources and some information on coping with grieving, because we thought, if the Olympics gets canceled or postponed, this is a real loss for so many of our athletes who have worked this hard to get there. So we had some materials put together. We had put together some presentations, written materials, presentations. We had some things ready to go. So that was pretty helpful, because when we saw it actually happen, we were able to send all this out to our athletes. And, for me, most of my sports are not in Colorado. They're all over the country. So I go with them to competitions, and then I follow up with them remotely anyhow. And so I was already doing this kind of virtual thing. That wasn't unusual for me. And I very quickly switched to 100% doing it. I would say it was more like 50 to 75% before. But I stopped traveling. I haven't traveled in a year now, and that's very unusual for me. I had 1 international trip a month and 1 or 2 domestic trips a month. Nothing for a year. So it's all been like this. And finally now I have a team that's out here for a camp for the first time. They've gone through a quarantine process, and we've finally got people actually training together. And it's been so fantastic to realize that people still are three-dimensional. It's not this thing that we're doing now. But so it's really good to start getting back into that. And I'll have a trip, I hope now, if it doesn't get canceled in about 2 weeks, I'll have another trip finally for the first time. So trying to gradually get back into it, but our medical director is still encouraging us not to meet in person if we can meet like this. And in psychology, it's been a lot easier to do that. So yeah, it's been a year like I've never had before in my life. I've never been a whole year not traveling. It's pretty different.
No, that's wild. And I know the pandemic has affected everyone's lives, everyone's jobs, and the things that they do totally different. And once again, I know when I came back to UCLA to train, it was just so nice to be able, even though everything was socially distanced, but just to have the privilege of being back, seeing people once you, like you said, kind of in 3D, like I wasn't used to seeing everyone virtually. So yeah, I think it's definitely been a year of change. So it's interesting to hear how your work has totally changed as well, and hopefully soon is somewhat getting back to a sense of normalcy as well. So I'm gonna start opening up questions. I see a few as well in the chat, and I'll call on you guys to unmute yourselves or I can ask it. But I see Nico, you have a question. Do you want to unmute as well and ask it?
Yeah, I'll ask it. Hey, Karen. So I'm a neuroscience major and actually on a pre-med track, and I know that sports psychology is a field that's been growing. Oh, so I was just wondering what kind of opportunities you see in the world of sports that could gel with a major like neuroscience.
Yeah, great question, Nico. That's I think we're starting to realize how much more we could do with the brain. And I guess related to that, we have a psychophysiologist on staff who does biofeedback and neurofeedback, and now has gotten really involved in the area of sleep and performance. And so I think it is starting to open up. I think it's a little bit newer. That area is a little bit newer than general sports psychology. But this is probably a great time to start getting in on that end of things, because we know the brain is so complex and really impacts performance. And there's so many questions that are not answered in terms of how the brain works and what kind of strategies we can use and what's effective and what's not. So I think there is sort of a subspecialty area that might be relevant to what you're talking about.
Thank you.
I also, oh yeah, anything else I was gonna say? Also, I guess going into, I see Connor has a question, and I can actually read it out loud. He says, "Hey Karen, I'm curious on how you decompress and relieve your own mental state. Also, do you notice trends with athletes that you can solve on a general basis, or do you handle each athlete on once again, a case by case basis?"
So for myself, after I quit gymnastics and recovered from the knee injuries and all that, I started to do triathlons. And so I guess I was able to keep up that competitive side of things, but it was more for fun. And so my own exercise program is very important to me to stay grounded and centered. And I try to get that in the morning, because if I wait any longer than that, my day gets away from me. But I really try to carve out that time. And my mornings also, I try to do my own mindfulness practice, because I think if I'm going to encourage athletes to do that, then I need to be doing it too. And I've done even more of that during the pandemic, which has been really helpful to stay grounded and deal with the many things that keep coming my way every day. Every day is different, and I never know what to expect. And sometimes there are crises and 3 things going on at once, and really need to be centered and focused to do those things. So, for myself, I try to practice what I preach. And in terms of, trends with our athletes, I would say probably, yeah, I probably focus more on the individual approach and one-on-one. That's probably my favorite thing to do, is one-on-one, sit down with an athlete, really understand them, understand who they are, where they've come from, the experiences they have, and what makes them who they are, and how that impacts their performance. But I think, I guess in terms of trends, I think what I'm seeing is how resilient our athletes are in dealing with so many unknowns and so many setbacks and changes in plans and being adaptable. And it's not that they don't go through hard, difficult times when an event gets canceled or when they realize maybe they can't achieve their goals of being an Olympian, but I see so much resilience and so much willingness to support and help each other. So it does sort of feel like a family in some ways as these athletes try to work together. But yeah, I'd say I tend to focus more on the individual athlete and what they need.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking or answering that question. And also another question from Alana. She says, "Hi, Karen. What are some performance mindset tips that you give athletes that could also apply to non-athletes?"
Well, I think that the mindfulness piece is that crosses almost everything, and I think anybody who is able to be present and manage their emotion and regulate that especially in times of stress, I think that can benefit everybody. I think that also the imagery aspect of things, anytime you're going into a performance situation, and that doesn't have to be a sport performance situation, it could be public speaking or a presentation or something like that also feels like a performance. It's good to imagine what that's going to be like ahead of time, and to even think through what could possibly go wrong and come up with solutions on the front end. That's what we do with our athletes a lot. What could happen? What could go wrong? What are you going to do? Okay, great. So if that happens, you have a plan. I think we can do that almost in any area of our lives. Or if it's having a difficult conversation with somebody, sort of thinking through, okay, what if I say this, how do I think they'll respond? Then how do I want to respond? How do we keep this productive? So I think there's a lot of ways that this crosses over.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering that question. And I see, Colin, you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cogan, for joining us tonight. My name is Colin Flintoft. I'm one of our vice presidents, and I'm a third-year student athlete playing football here at UCLA. And I was just curious, who would you say is like your favorite mindfulness teacher, or like some type of enlightenment, teacher that you've learned from, and how and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have really taken in information from a lot of different mindfulness instructors, and I think the first one I spent any time reading about was Jon Kabat-Zinn, he's pretty well known. But I've learned a lot from other people as well, and there's a really great app that I've enjoyed using. It's called Healthy Minds, and I'm blanking on the name of the person who it'll come to me, but the one who is, I guess, in charge, he's been also really interesting for me to listen to and learn from. So I wouldn't say that there's any one person. I've really tried a lot of different approaches to that, and but I would say to start with, the basis probably would have been Jon Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me asking further, is he more like sports performance focused, or what does
No,
he focus on?
he's general. He's straight mindfulness. And yeah, so if you look him up, he's very so easy to listen to. He writes well, he speaks well. He really, every time I listen to him, I learn some other nuance related to being mindful that I hadn't picked up on before. On the surface, it seems like it's really simple. Okay, you're just staying with your breath, you're trying to stay present. How hard can that be? But there's just so much more to it. There's so much underneath it.
Absolutely. If you don't mind me asking also, have you ever heard of like Eckhart Tolle? And if so, like, what are your thoughts on him?
No, have not. Who is that?
He's similar. He's like a mindfulness teacher. I actually discovered him a few years ago, and I think it sounds pretty similar to what you're saying. He's been on like Oprah and stuff like many times. Worth checking out. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure you probably know more than him or something, but he's really cool to check out.
Yeah, I probably won't know more, but I'll definitely check him out. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Sure thing.
It looks like we also have a question from Nick. Nick, can you unmute yourself and ask your question as well?
Yeah. Hi, Karen. I'm the one who you've been actually emailing back and forth. I appreciate how responsive how well you've been responding and how fast, and been really great at communicating. So I appreciate you being here. So my question is, how has your preparation for when you're going to your first Olympic Games, your thoughts and how you were preparing to be there, and kind of your like how it felt to be there, and going to a later one like your sixth or seventh, how your preparation has changed and how the feeling of being there? Is it another day at the office, or is there still the awe of being there? Kind of how has that happened for you?
Yeah, that's a funny story. Glad you asked. So my first Olympic Games was as a sports psychologist. I've never gone as an athlete. As a sports psychologist was Salt Lake City in 2002. I was working with the US mogul team. And so, I thought, okay, this is my first Olympics. I don't know what this is going to be like. I've got to be ready. I really want to do a good job for this team. I'm invested. I'm connected with these athletes. I really want the best for them. And and this was, soon after 9/11. So there was a lot of security it was about 5 months after 9/11. And so a lot of security because there was some concern that we would have another terrorist attack. Didn't end up being that way. It kind of settled down after about the first 5 days, I would say. But anyhow, as when I work with skiers, I typically have been at the top of the course because that's where if something's going to go wrong, it's right before they go. It's not at the bottom of the course. So I try to position myself up at the top of the course, and it's where I've always been, every competition. And one of the coaches was concerned that there were too many people there. It was going to be, that the officials were going to get upset. And he said, I don't think you should be up there. I think probably you should be at the bottom of the course. And I thought, well, I don't know. That's not really a great place for me to be. It's never where I am. The athletes don't know I'm there. But I mean, I don't want to get kicked out of the Olympics, so I'll go to the bottom of the course. So I'm at the bottom of the course. I'm sitting around thinking, how am I supposed to do this? And we had walkie-talkies at that time. That was how we communicated, not cell phones. And so I'm standing there, and all of a sudden the coach is at the bottom of the course. They're turning around and they're looking my direction. And I'm like, what? I'm looking like, what's going on behind me? They're looking at me like, no, you, the athlete wants to talk to you. They're looking for you. I'm like, okay. So I get on the walkie-talkie and she says, I'm freaking out. It's before her Olympic run. I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do. I need your help. And so I talked her through it a little bit, but I'm thinking that just wasn't great. And she did her run and it wasn't her best. And it was really disappointing. And I thought, that's it. I'm going up to the top of the course. I don't care. Like, they'll have to kick me out. So I made that decision. I'm just gonna go where I'm supposed to be. And I got up there, and some of the officials said, "Where have you been? We thought you're supposed to be up here." And so anyhow, it turned out fine. But I think what I learned was, like sometimes maybe you don't have to be such a big rule follower, even at the Olympics. And I have used that when I've had to make a decision in future Olympics about what I should do. I have always gone back to that and thought, in my gut, I knew what the right thing was to do. And in my gut, I usually know what the right thing is to do. And so that has served me well. In fact, in Rio, I had a similar situation, and I chose to go with my gut, and it turned out the way it was supposed to. So I think that I learned from that. But, we're all rookies at some point, and the worst mistake would be not to learn from those mistakes and bring that information the next time around. So, but now, going into Tokyo, there's going to be so many things that we're not prepared for, that we don't know how they're going to be. It's going to be very, very different. It's like the first Olympics for everybody, even those of us who have been in the movement for a long time. So, we have to be ready for anything. We have to be able to think on our feet, adjust. We're going to be doing things we hadn't thought we'd ever have to do. It's going to be a whole new experience.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
I see also questions from Alicia and Delaney. Alicia, do you want to go first and ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Alicia. I'm on the tennis team here at UCLA. And I just kind of wanted to know your thoughts on apps like Headspace, because they're promoted so much here at UCLA, and I just wanted to, know your thoughts on them.
Sure. Thanks, Alicia. Well, I like Headspace. I think that's a great app, and it is very well known. In fact, we have an agreement with them right now at the Olympic Committee, and many of our athletes are using it. I actually think that I really like some other apps too. And one of them I mentioned before, Healthy Minds. The reason I like that one is because there's an option to do either sitting or still meditation or a more active meditation. And by active, I don't mean actually doing your sport, but it's more like maybe walking or some sort of movement, and they give you that choice. I think that really works well for athletes because athletes are so used to moving. In fact, I like that. I'm used to moving, not sitting still. So I like that they have that alternative. And then there's another one called Insight Timer. And I like that one. Oh, and the Healthy Minds app is free to everybody. Insight Timer, there is a free version also, but it's got thousands of meditations, different people, different voices, different approaches, different time frames. You know, if you have 5 minutes, you can plug that in and come up with several that are 3, 4, 5 minutes long. Or if you have 20 minutes, you can choose from the 20-minute ones. And there's so many to choose from. You can sort of find the ones that you like that fit what you're looking for, the voice tone you like, or the style that you like. So I found that one to be really useful. So those are the two that I usually suggest to people.
Thank you.
Sure.
And then Delaney, you can go ahead and ask your question as well.
Hi, Karen. I'm a third year psychology major, and I was just kind of curious about some of the research that you focused on during your doctoral program and kind of what prepared you for your later work as like in a professional setting.
Yeah, sure. So I would not consider myself to be a researcher. Like that's not the primary part of what I do, but of course to get a doctoral degree, you do research. So my research was, I did a comparison of a sports psychology intervention program with gymnastics teams. And I had one gymnastics team that participated in the intervention, and then I had a control group who did not participate. And the two focus points were on team atmosphere, team building, and anxiety management. And so I had an intervention for both of those things, and they filled out questionnaires at the beginning and a couple times in the middle, and then at the end on their analysis of their team dynamics, you know, team closeness, and then their levels of anxiety. And it turned out that the intervention was effective, but it was a very small group, you know, small sample size. And so it was really very preliminary in nature. So that was, I guess, maybe my big research project, but I've done a couple others along the way where I've been a second or third or fourth author with some colleagues. But I would say that probably I rely more on other people to do the research, and then I implement it. I want them to come up with, what does this mean? And then I take it to my athletes and design the interventions.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I see Emily, you have your hand up as well. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for being here with us. My name is Emily. I was a psychology major as well, and a student athlete on the swim team at UCLA. And my question is, are all Olympic athletes required to have scheduled sessions with sports psychologists, or is it only if they ask? And also, do you have to understand the team and the sport, I guess, that the athlete is playing, and how in depth?
And sorry, Emily, I didn't hear the first part of what you said. Are they required to schedule appointments? Was that what you asked?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, nobody's required to see me at all. It's offered as a service, as an option. There are some times where a coach will highly recommend it, or somebody will highly recommend it if there's a problem of some sort. And so athletes might feel like they're required, I suppose. But no, it's optional. And in fact, I would much rather work with someone who chooses to be there than somebody who is required to be there. I think it's not usually as productive. So my approach is to, even if someone comes in because they're required, I say, look, I know that you've been asked to do this, but this really needs to be your choice, your decision. So let's figure out what you want here. And if you do want to work, let's find a goal to work toward. If you don't, that's fine. I'm always here if you're ready. But no, mostly it is optional, and they choose to come in and continue working with me. And then the other part of your question was?
How much do you have to understand the sport that your athlete is in?
Well, you know, I had never fenced before I started working with fencers, and I think they kind of, I mean, they weren't really expecting to have a sports psychologist who knew fencing, so that was okay. And they have been really gracious about teaching me about their sport. I've been working with fencing now for 10 years, so I actually do know a fair amount about it. But I've been to many tournaments and I've talked to the athletes, the coaches. I sit and listen to them on the sidelines as they talk about strategy, and I sit in video sessions with them. So I've learned how to help them better. And it certainly is beneficial to talk the language of the sport, but I don't think you necessarily have to have done the sport to be effective and successful. As I said in the beginning, I think there's more commonalities among athletes in sport than there are differences. But at the same time, you really have to understand some of the nuances of the sport to be the most effective. So it is a learning process, but I think you can still work with a sport that you don't have as much knowledge of. You just have to be really willing to learn and to be honest about what you don't know.
Thank you.
I have another question that actually kind of made me think of within my experience. So one of the things, so I was also a psychology undergrad, and I remember one of the things I learned, I think it was in my cognitive psych class, was about how you can't necessarily unlearn things. You can only like either relearn things as well, and like it's different associations to things. So I know for a lot of athletes, whether they're professional or at a college level, sport and the field, the track, the court is like an outlet for them. But at sometimes maybe the culture of the team or an event happened that made their sport kind of like traumatic. And so what do you recommend for when, you know, their one outlet at the time maybe is their sport, but they're kind of having like that internal battle where it's not necessarily like the healthiest relationship that they have with their sport, but it's like their reliant one outlet that they have. I don't know how, like what recommendations you would kind of give for athletes maybe in that situation as well.
Well, you know, I don't think there's an easy fix to that, and that probably requires several meetings and really exploring what the sport meant to them and then what happened to where now there's more of this traumatic association with it. And so I am very patient, you know, and I want to give athletes choices. So my job is not to make sure they stick to their sport. My job is only to do that if that's what they want. So my job is to help them figure out, what do they want? Do they want to continue working toward their sport? Do they want to work through the trauma? Or are they really saying, I just don't want to do this sport anymore? Because sometimes that's what's going on, but it's really hard to say that. So my job is to get to the bottom of it, to get to the truth. And, you know, I'm not like the coach who says, no, you got to stick with it. I really need you on the team. Like, I don't care. They stay, they go. I'm not motivated one way or the other to have an athlete go a certain direction. I want them to go the direction they want to go. And I also have a background in trauma recovery. So there might be some things that we do along those lines, like what was it that was traumatic about the sport, and how do you work through that? You know, how do you face the trauma? How do you find ways of coping with the emotions that go along with it? How do you rewrite the story about what this sport means to you, or how you want to, what your relationship is to the sport. So there's a lot of things we would do. It probably would take some time to get there, though.
Yeah, no, definitely. That makes sense. And it relates to what you were saying earlier about kind of having that heart for the person, not just the athlete, who's the person behind the athlete, which is so crucial within the sports world, is having access to people like that, since oftentimes a lot of the authority figures around you are always pushing you just to keep going with your sport, no matter, what your relationship is with it as well. I see a question from Colin asking specifically about, since Olympic athletes aren't mandated to necessarily set up appointments with the psychologist, if you could estimate what type of percentage of Olympic athletes do use this psychology services. Is it not as frequent? Is it becoming more frequent? And what does that look like?
Well, to really answer that question, I'd have to actually know how many Olympic athletes we have, and we don't know. It's that's the question we're all trying to answer right now. Who is in our Olympic pool? And, we have some idea, but always every Olympics, there's somebody who jumps onto the scene right at the last minute and takes an Olympic spot, and you didn't even see it coming, really, young athlete perhaps, that everything went right for them that day on the Olympic trials, and there they are. So we don't actually know exactly what our numbers are. So therefore, it's a little hard to estimate how many. But I am specifically tasked with working with sort of the top tier athletes, and those are the ones that we think have the best chance to make the Olympic team. And I would say on the sports that I work with closely, and I know I said I'm responsible for 11 sports, but I don't work with all of them in the same way. I probably work with 5 of them pretty closely, and then I have some contractors that work with some of the others. But I would say that the ones I work closely with, I have had some sort of contact with, I would say 80 to 90% of the athletes. At least I know them, they know me. Now, whether we've actually sat down together, that could be perhaps 50%, but I'm guessing because we don't even know what our base number is. And sometimes they'll sit down with me for 1 or 2 times. There's some athletes I've been working with for the full 10 plus years that I've been at the Olympic Committee. They've been in the Olympic movement for that long. So some of them I have very long-standing relationships with, and others it's really just this year. So they kind of come and go just depending on what they need. It's very fluid that way.
Yeah, thank you. Colin, I don't know if you wanted to add on to that question that you had, or if you have another one.
Yeah, I kind of have another one, and that's really cool. 50% sounds like a really high number to me, which is good, and hopefully that keeps growing. And it makes sense. The best of the best, they utilize all the possible services, get the mind right and all that. And so I was curious, like as an athlete myself, I've heard of like athletes, like as an athlete, your sport is pretty integral to like who you are, since it takes up just so much time in your life and all that. And so I was curious if you've ever worked with an athlete as he or she is like retiring from their sport and experiences like a potential identity crisis. And if so, what advice do you usually give them to help them like deal with that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, this year, some athletes decided that, they were good for 2020, but they're not good for one more year, and it's time to retire. And those were very difficult decisions, especially in light of the fact that we didn't really know what was going to happen. And so I will say that a lot of athletes that I work with closely had other plans like graduate school, or some were going to law school, medical school. Some of them are very accomplished, not just athletically, but academically. So they kind of had this backup plan, I guess. And it was a little bit easier to make that transition because there was something that they had on the horizon. Others, though, it's hasn't been as easy because this has been their identity and their life. And we fortunately have some really good programs at the US OPC. We have something called the ACE program, Athlete Career Education Program, and they do a lot on that in the area of transition, athlete transition from sport to life, career, that kind of thing. So they have a ton of resources. So I've worked in conjunction with that department quite a bit in terms of supporting athletes. But we really start to look at, what did sport mean? How did what was that part of you and that identity? What did that mean to you? And what are the skills that you learned as an athlete that now you can take with you into the work world? And there are lots of skills, from being organized and focused and driven and persistent, all those things that make good athletes also make good employees. And so there are ways that they can market themselves. And sometimes athletes don't realize what they learned. They think, I've just been an athlete all my life. What kind of work experience is that? But, we can talk about how do you present yourself. So there's some ideas along those lines that we talk about, but it can be a very painful process. It is a grieving process. It's a loss, giving up the sport. And sometimes that takes a long time to get through.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. Thank you. And it sounds like there's some good options for those people. I guess one final question for me, at least, would just be real quick. Do you have any like favorite book or podcast recommendations you would give to us?
I do have a few. If you're interested in just sort of really basic mental skills training, there's a book called Mind Gym by Gary Mack that is very straightforward, easy to read, quick to get through. But if you want something more, I guess, complex, there's Michael Phelps's coach, Bob Bowman, wrote a book about how he worked with Michael Phelps, the way they trained, and the mental side of training is in there. And I found that fascinating, just how very specific his pre-performance plan was, and all the things that he did to prepare for any possible thing to go wrong. And I think there's a lot of life lessons, and not just sport, but a lot of life lessons you can get from that one. Another book that I read recently was, it's called The Rise of Superman by Stephen Kotler. Very interesting look at some extreme sport athletes and the state of flow, which kind of being in the zone, but that state of flow that athletes get into to reach a peak performance. Very interesting, and again, maybe not as applicable to the real world, because there aren't so many people who do those sorts of extreme things. But I think that the takeaway is really, how do you achieve a peak performance? How do you get into the zone? So those are a few ideas. And then, well, I don't have as many recommendations on podcasts really, but I would suggest those mindfulness apps that I talked about, Insight Timer and Healthy Minds. I think those are pretty helpful in that area.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure thing.
And I see also one last question too from Nathan. Nathan was asking kind of what, similarly, I guess, from what you've been speaking about, like what other steps would you recommend for us to rest and refocus our minds?
Well, I think that's a bit individual, but some things to consider besides the mindfulness one, which of course I keep pushing. I think exercise and physical activity is really important, not just competitive kind of athletics, but more just having something that you enjoy doing that gets your body moving. I know for myself, I've been sitting more than ever this past year, and that's really bad, I think. So, but getting out, walking and talking, like having meetings while you're walking, I find that to be actually invigorating. It makes you think in a different way sometimes because you're moving, not just sitting. So those kinds of things are important. I think the social connection with other people, and that's been more challenging, but we've got to keep finding creative ways of doing that. I just think that's so important as you try to find ground and center yourself. So those are a few ideas. Some people like reading or music or artistic types of endeavors. I think you find what works for you and stick with it, but don't be afraid to try some new things, because maybe you'll find something that really is effective that you never thought of before.
Awesome. Thank you. I know that's a huge thing, especially now in the pandemic, is sometimes going on those meeting walks, or whether it's just like getting some fresh air, since we're taking like all of our classes or meeting calls in like our bedroom.
Yeah, exactly.
To like, kind of feel like so much in a bubble too.
Yeah.
Nowadays.
Yeah, I just, one more thing on that. I ever since this lockdown happened, I've really tried to stick to my routine. And it's really easy to fall into, you get up 5 minutes before your meeting, put yourself, turn your camera off, just there's your name there. Yeah, I'm in the meeting, but I really I do my workout in the morning, I do my meditation, I get ready, I get dressed, I get my face on the camera. Like, I've tried to stay as much similar as to my work week and my work day as I was before. And I think it's making it easier for me to transition back into the in-person work that I'm doing. But that's another thing that I think might be worth trying, even though it feels like more work. I think it's good to stick to your routine, stick to your schedule.
Yeah, awesome advice. Thank you so much for that. I think a lot of us will definitely, take that into consideration just moving forward for how we can go about our day-to-day lives too. We'll just want to be mindful of time too, because I know we just had blocked out this hour. I don't know if there's any other questions from the group, but thank you so much once again, Karen, for being here and answering all the questions. And I'll also just close us out too with the remaining aspects of our presentation. And so just a shout out to, once again, thanks Karen for being here. Thank you members for being here. Next week, just so you guys know, same time, we're actually having a collaboration with UC Irvine Sports Business Association. So that will be a totally different type of meeting, where we have a panel of guest speakers as well. So that will kind of be more of a networking experience. So be on the lookout for that. Once again, check out the chat if you guys are members as well, or if not, please fill out that attendance form so we can give you guys points and credit for showing up today, as we try to reward our guests and all of our members as well. So please fill that out when you get a chance. And that's all for today. Once again, everyone, round of applause for Karen and Dr. Cogan. Thank you so much for being here as a fellow alum too. It really, really means a lot just to hear from your experience and the things that you've learned throughout your journey, the things that you apply to your day-to-day. It's super, super valuable, especially in a time like this. So thank you so much again. We're so appreciative of you being here today.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. You guys have been a wonderful audience. Great questions, great discussion. And I love connecting back with UCLA students again. So thank you also.